All right, so today we're going to talk about timing and spacing, and to illustrate timing and spacing, we're going to use our friend the bouncing ball. Now, timing and spacing, kind of a confusing concept to begin with. Timing refers to the amount of time it takes for an action to happen, and spacing refers to the distance between each pose. So the bouncing ball is one of the easiest ways to illustrate this, and so by that, let's start with just going through the controls of the bouncing ball, and then we'll go through how we want to look at our timing and spacing. So when you first open this file in your CG Spectrum course folder, it looks like this, and you have all these controls. This control here on the outside, the yellow one, is the ball placement control, and that's really all you use it for. Wherever you're going to start your ball bouncing is where you put your placement. I just sort of leave it where it comes in at, and I don't touch it again. Now we have these two rings here. We got a blue one and a red one. The blue one is the move control, and this is the one we're going to use the most because it's the one that moves our ball around. The center one here, or the red one, is our rotation. It rotates our ball. Wonderful. Okay. Next is our squash control. So we have a control on the top. If we select it and hit W for translation, we can see we can squash and stretch our ball from the top. There's one along here in the bottom. And then this here, this big middle one here, this big middle line, that helps to direct our squash if we want our squash and stretch to happen on an angle like that. And we'll get into that. But for now, we're just going to have our ball bouncing up and down. All right, so to get ready for this, there's a few things I want to do. First, I'm going to hide this grid just for this exercise. So I go up here to this panel, and you see the little grid icon there. I'm going to click on that, and that's going to hide the grid. Next, I'm going to go in, I'm going to create a ground plane. So I'm going to go Create, Polygon Primitives, and I'm going to go down to Plane. Click on that, and your icon will give you this little box and plus sign there. And I'm just going to drag that. It's going to give me a ground plane. Once that's once I've created it, I'm going to go into Scale, and I'm just going to select all three, X, Y, and Z. I'm going to type in the number 100, and that's just going to make this thing big enough that, I don't have to worry about, bouncing off the ground plane. Okay, so I don't want to be able to select that ground plane, so I'm going to go back up here again to my set of selection boxes, and I'm going to turn everything off other than NURBS curve. So now I can no longer select that plane. If you need to select that plane and move it, you can always go back up and turn on geo selection here, and you can select it. But for me, I only want to select NURBS curves. So now I can draw a big box around all of it. Hit S. Again, I'm working in auto key here. I set my first key, so now every time I move something, it's automatically going to set a key. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go to this outside ring, our move controller, and I'm going to move it up. So it's right on the ground there. And that's our frame 1. Actually, scratch that. Let's make that frame 12. So I'm going to select everything again, and I'm going to copy this frame over to frame 12. I'm going to make a 24 frame bounce. So I'm going to go to frame 1 with everything selected. I'm going to hold down my middle mouse button, and I'm going to drag this to frame 12. I'm going to let go my middle mouse button and hit S. And that has copied that frame over. Now, before we go any further, let's make sure our preferences are set properly. For this exercise, we're going to work in spline. We're not going to worry about working in step because we can just spline all the way through this. It's easier to work that way with a bouncing ball. So we're going to open up our preference editor over here. We're going to click on animation, and where it says default out tangents, we're going to set to auto. Now, because I've copied this key over already, I'm going to have to open up my graph editor and make sure that this is splined. So I select all my keys, and I hit my auto tangent. And I can see it looks like I didn't copy that over, so I'm going to try to copy that over one more time. Interesting. Just double checking to see what I might be missing. Aha, nope. Okay, so now we have our frame 12 is where we're going to be on the ground. So let's, by using our move controller, I think we'll just use our move controller for this and our squash and stretch. Let's go to frame 1 and let's just drag that ball up. Wonderful. All right, so now when we scrub, we can see that our ball is falling. And let's, for frame 24, let's copy. I'm going to select everything here. Let's copy 1, hold down middle mouse button on frame 1. Let's drag that over here to frame 24. Let's hit S. And now our ball, with these 3 keys, will be bouncing. Let me just look at my preferences again, and let's play this real time at 24 frames per second. And let's look at it now. There's our bounce. Now, it doesn't really look like a very good bounce. It doesn't look like it's falling quickly. It's slowing into the bottom, and it's slowing out at the top. So now we have a 24 frame bounce. So our timing is 1 second. If we're looking at 24 frames per second, it's taking 1 second or 24 frames for this ball to hit, 12 frames to hit the ground, another 12 frames to hit the top. So 24 frames or 1 second for it to complete its cycle. And that's our timing. Now, if we look at our spacing, and I'm going to just turn everything off here. I'm going to show none, and I'm going to go back to show all and just show the polygons. If we look at what our spacing is doing, we can see where the problem is with our animation. So I'm going to just select the grease pencil here, and I'm going to, I got to go back to show, grease pencil, and I'm just going to outline our ball over these 12 frames. Let's alternate the colors perhaps to better see what's happening, or else we're just going to have these big blobs of red. Now we can go, now let's keep on with our alternating colors. I'm drawing with a mouse because that's the kind of professionalism that this type of thing calls for. Once I get this all outlined here, all the way down to frame 12, we can talk about our spacing. 8, somewhere in there. 9, somewhere like there. Not terribly accurate, but it'll be accurate enough. 10. 11. And finally 12. Which is almost the same as 11. Now, we want to talk about spacing here. So to talk about spacing, let's look at the spacing of our ball falling. And let's talk about how acceleration works. So if you look at anything on any film or any clip of animation, you'll understand that if we're to see a ball falling like this, it starts out with the frames very, very close together, but as it falls, the spacing gets greater and greater and progressively greater until the bottom. And the fact that these spaces get bigger until it hits the bottom, that's what gives us our acceleration. Can I do this? Acceleration. Okay, and acceleration is dependent on these spaces getting greater. If for any reason, and you can see these two are getting less, if by any reason we have a frame in here, it's going to soften or it's going to interrupt our acceleration. So that's why if we look at this ball falling over these 12 frames, and let's just bring this back to 12 so we can see it properly. It's slowing in on the bottom. It's slowing out at the top, meaning that the spacing is tight at the top. It slows out. Then it starts to pick up speed, but then it slows in at the bottom and it slows down before it hits the ground. Now, for a ball to fall and slow down, it has to hit something that slows it down, water or heavier air or something. And if we look at our spacing, we can see that our spacing starts to increase here. But then as it gets closer to the bottom, we notice that it gets tighter. Right? This is just sloppy drawing on my part. But we see that it increases and then it decreases down here. And that's not what we want. So our spacing is wrong. So what do we do to fix that? Well, fortunately, it's fairly simple once you understand what you're looking for. Let's go back in here and take a look. We'll grab our outside controller here, our move controller. And then let's go into the graph editor. I have made a hotkey for my graph editor up here, but if you're looking for your graph editor, you can just go Window, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. And here it is. And because we're only animating in one channel, we are animating in Translation Y here. So we open up our graph editor and we click on Translate Y and we hit F, and that shows us our Translate Y curve. Now how this curve works is basically how you see it bouncing here. On frame 1 and frame 24, we're up high. On frame 12, we're on the ground. So what I want to do here, and you can see by our curve, you can see how we're slowing out, and then we accelerate, and then right around here on frame 8, we start to slow in again, and that acceleration is interrupted. And then as we bounce up, again, we slow out, which is not how a ball works, but then we slow in at the top, and that slow in at the top is just fine, but it's this slowing out, in and out on the bottom where it hits the ground that you have a problem with. So I'm going to select that key, and I'm going to go up to this little hotkey up here, this little button, and that's the break tangent button, and I'm going to click it. And that's going to allow me to grab these tangents. And so I'll select one side of it with the left mouse click, left mouse button. And then I'm going to grab it, left mouse click as well. And I'm just going to drag that up. I'm going to do the same with this side. You can right mouse button that as well. So now we have this acceleration, and it speeds up, and it goes bounce, and it speeds up and out of that again and bounces up. So if we take a look at what that looks like. Now that looks more like a bouncing ball. Now let's go one step further. Let's add a little bit of squash and stretch to that bouncing ball. So let's go to frame 12. And to do this properly, we're going to want to add another key to the bottom here so we can really feel that squash. So I'm going to, at frame 12 with the move controller selected, I'm going to middle mouse button, move over, and I'm going to key that on frame 13. So now my ball is going to be on the ground for 2 frames because I really want to feel that squash. Now this has broken everything here, so I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to select linear tangents, and that will flatten all that kind of stuff out. Now I also still want to have them broken because I still want to be able to adjust them. So both these keys are broken. And now if we watch the bounce, see, it hasn't changed it much. It's just giving me 2 frames to work with. So now let's look at our squash. Let's go to frame, I'm going to go to frame 11, and I'm going to select my top squash and stretch controller here. That's called the ball top control. And I'm going to stretch it. Then on 12, I'm going to squash it. I'm going to leave it for now. Let's see. Actually, let me undo that. On 12, I'm going to stretch it. On 13, I'm going to squash it. And on 14, I'm going to zero it out. All right. Now, let's grab our bottom control here. And on 12, we have it zeroed out. On 13, we can leave it zeroed out. And on 14, let's stretch it. Let's see what that looks like. Don't see much of that squash. So let's see if we can sell that squash a bit more. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to 11. I'm going to key it there on both the top and the bottom. Then on 12, let's try to squash it. And let's see what that looks like. There, now we're starting to see a little squash in there. Nice. And we could play with that a bit more too by keeping this thing stuck to the ground. And then here on 15, we could drag that down like that. And then make sure that this one is zeroed out. Ooh, that's going to look interesting. Probably a little too much. Let's just drag that one up a little bit. And you can see you can play around that squash and stretch to give your ball a different feel. And now we can go to the top here, where it bounces up, and we can squash this bottom. And I'm going to copy that over, that same squash over to frame 1. All right, so we can really have some fun with it and really start to feel that squash and stretch. And now that our timing and our spacing are set, it starts to become easier to manipulate that. I'm going to just zero that out for now, because I think that's just a little too much. So I just go to the frame, I go to the translation Y, and just hit 0 and zero that out, because I think that feels pretty good. And that's essentially our timing and spacing lesson. How this applies to any other animation that you do, I will show you in just 1 second. All right, so now we have a full animated character here. He just takes a couple steps forward and spins and does a turn. Now, it's not a bad piece of animation. It still needs some work, but it gets our point across pretty clearly. Timing and spacing wise, our timing is taking 90 frames to do this move, and the spacing is happening all over the place. So a good place to start with how we use timing and spacing when we're doing full body characters is we'll start with the COG. Now the COG is the point of the character that influences everything. So it's a very important one. So as we watch how this guy moves, we can see the spacing is very important. We can see the distance that he's traveling. I like to look just right around here, like around his butt, and I see how that spacing is happening. I see how he's moving forward. It gets a little bit bigger. As he's coming down here, his weight's coming down. The spacing is going to get a bit bigger because he's accelerating. And then as he starts to do his turn, the spacing gets a little bit tighter. And of course, we look at the spacing from the side, or sorry, from the front, I should say, and we can see that as he moves his weight across, see how he starts with his weight on this leg. As he moves it across, the spacing is very important. I'm watching the spacing of the edge of his body here, and I want to just make sure it never locks up. It slows in. See how the spacing's big through here while he's pushing off this leg, so my spacing's large. And then he slows in. And then here, as his weight's going down in translation Y, and if we open up our graph editor, we'll see that the spacing in translation Y starts to get greater, right? This is our acceleration here. So we can see that our spacing's not very big here. He's hardly moving. He's moving a little bit, and then boom, here is where he drops down, and our spacing gets greater. The same thing goes for his upper body. Through here, you can see that my timing and spacing is very important. It matters with the arms. you can see that there's this long slow in and then the arms bounce down like that. So timing and spacing, we start with the bouncing ball, but as we move forward and work forward, we realize that it applies to everything that we do. It's why it's one of the original fundamentals that we want to look at. It's incredibly important. Moving forward with your bouncing ball, part of the assignment, I'd like to see a ball bouncing up and down, like I just did here. And then I'd like to see one bouncing across the screen. And then also I would like to see different weights. Do a rubber ball, do one of your choice. I think maybe make it into a bowling ball, maybe a balloon is quite tricky. A beach ball is good. Anything you can think of to practice this timing and spacing, because once you get that concept down and you learn how to apply it to a character like this, there's so much you can do with your animation. All right, thank you.